Yeah, and try to remember, we did have a topic chosen for the show, which was sensationalism in the media, and I'd like to try at least to pretend that we do have that topic. Well, no, I mean, I've got lots I can say about that. I find it detestable what was just being described a little while ago about the arsenic bug being so grossly misrepresented in the news. Every time there's a new anthropological find, for example, the news media says, even if it confirms everything we knew and everything we were expecting and everything we were looking for, and we have the confirmation, it's not presented as a confirmation. It forces scientists to rethink everything they thought they knew, as if, you know, go ahead.
Or transitional fossil number 537 is found, and the caption is, "Could this be the missing link?" You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
the missing link.
Right? You know what I mean? It's like, it's okay. Yeah, just put it on my tab. It's really
don't access
more of the appropriate response because there's just so much.
Sorry, the next caller's internet connection is pretty bad, so I'm going to ask him quickly to post his question and see if we can get it in before it fails.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed, sir. How are you?
Doing fantastic. I'd just like to say, huge fan of all you guys, subscribe to all your channels, love you guys. And my question was from a few shows ago when you guys were addressing the progress of science, and it seems to me that as the complexity of the scientific fields increases, it becomes more and more difficult to properly train people in those fields. So I see this fundamental tension between the progress of science and the popular education of science. So if you could address that in turn, I'd be great.
That's a good question. It's not even that it's requiring more education. We're being educated in more and more esoteric fields. So most of the stuff that I'm a specialist in, most people I would have to have probably a 2-hour conversation just to sort of get them up to speed to that level. And the kind of information we're producing doesn't always translate back to an immediate benefit to people. So I see where you're coming from. I think it's a good point that it gets harder and harder. And bringing this back to what Aaron was proposing as a topic, it gets harder and harder to get people involved in basic research. It's hard to get excited about the interaction of water molecules in a certain kind of matrix and whether or not they interact in a biphasic or a monophasic way, or whether or not this or that. So none of that makes headlines because it's so esoteric. And so now people like NASA, organizations like NASA, are retaining PR press agents in order to make basic research interesting for people so that public support is there, which of course public support always translates into financial support. So it's almost an inevitability that we would have this kind of sensationalism because people are getting further and further away from relating to the kind of research that we're doing now. Good question.
Yeah. Actually, I'm curious to ask a couple of you about this. I was looking at a New York Times article just the other day. It's talking about a new field called meta-research. Are you aware of it? Where researching actually other researchers' work and how they're doing their research and how accurate it is. It's making claims that there's actually a high failure rate, especially in certain fields, especially like the medical field, for research, for example, depending on the type of studies they're doing. Have you followed any of this at all? Because it's a relatively new concept to me. They're claiming, for example, that some of the failure rates can range anywhere from 10 to 50% on the results given.
So there's a couple of things. There's the file drawer effect, right, which is that negative results, things that don't validate a hypothesis that's interesting, rarely get published, and that stuff's been sitting in file drawers forever. And some of the newer publication requirements include pre-registering things like clinical trials. A lot of research fails, but that's also interesting, right? And a lot of times we have a hard time validating an initial study in a field. And this is something I work in personally. I work with a virus called XMRV, which only about 50% of the labs that attempt are able to amplify, are able to detect with assays. And as a result, there are a lot of people asking whether or not it's even real. Now, there was a very interesting first study that was definitive, well put together, and the results were very exciting. But the more people that attempt to replicate those results, the harder it's getting to get a good definitive answer on it. There's names for all these effects, and it's frustrating as a researcher to have to deal with not even knowing whether or not the thing you're studying is a real phenomenon or whether it's sort of an artifact of the tests. It is scary. That's all. My final conclusion on that topic is it's really hard to deal with those kinds of issues because we're limited by the tools that we have until my shrink ray works.
In my experience, at least, being in the medical field, it's one of those things where there's such a big difference between journals like Nature and then dental journals. Probably the most prominent one being JADA, or the Journal of the American Dental Association, or even the Lancet and things like that. There's just such a big difference in terms of what qualifies and what can sneak past the editors in getting published. I've seen stuff. There was an article this year, for example, talking about how this one anesthetic can cause paresthesia, which is basically like a temporary paralysis of one of the nerves and prolonged feelings of numbness. And to do this, they say in their first line of their materials and methods section that we gathered all of our data from the FDA adverse event reporting system to compile the incidence rates for this. And then you go to the FDA site, and right there, at the top of the page, it says this data cannot be used for. And stuff like that simply wouldn't get in other journals. So I think that there's also a little bit of a difference in quality control for the medical journals, the dental journals, things like that, and then the more hardcore scientific journals such as Nature, for example. So at least that's just my experience.
It's journalism. I'm an English major, and I worked on a student newspaper at the time. But with the recent Gifford shooting, I remember a lot of the news were rushing to hurry up and get the story out because, again, sensationalism works. But a lot of them were saying Giffords was already dead on the scene. And we know it's simply not true. But other people picked up on the story and said, oh, yes, Giffords died. And it's a race for journalists to make sure they're the first person to scoop everyone else, because then everyone starts quoting them and then they get more readers. It's insane how bad it is in journalism right now. It's all about the money. And there's just no need for them to check their facts, because if they're wrong, then maybe on page 8 the next day they can put, oh, we accidentally got this wrong. And they'll just keep on doing the same headlines. Listen today.
And it's also a matter of they're out there to simply sell. For example, New Scientist, was Darwin wrong? People aren't going to sit there and read the analysis of. Certainly some people will, but the vast majority of people will simply see that headline and be like, scientific community united, what about this? And they're in there trying to sensationalize things to sell copies as opposed to reporting what's accurately there. So they're ignorant on the subject mostly to begin with. I'm talking about reporters in general with scientific matters. They're ignorant on the subject to begin with, and B, they've got a motive to make it as dramatic as possible to try and sell. And I think the combination of those two things, its accuracy is out the window in favor of, just purely getting out copies and selling what you need to sell and doing what you need to do. So I think that the only way to really stop that is if if the public really gets on it, and sort of decries it and gets pissed off about it, but they're not going to do that. So, well, good.
Luca, does that address what you were asking about? And then
yeah, somewhat. It was actually I wasn't clear possibly what I was saying when I said failure rate. I didn't mean an actual failure rate in the study. The ending results. What I mean is that a failure, for example, is in how they set their hypothesis. They would taint the hypothesis with by inadvertently looking for a result, for example, and thus leading to a poor conclusion. Something like that. It seems that there's a lot more of that going on than, or at least so this person claims. I'm not saying it is. So the person claims who's doing the research. He's saying that it actually could have beneficial effects, the research he's doing in his field.
It's true. It's something that we talk about in research. It's called harking. So it's hypothesizing after results are known.
Harking. Yes, exactly. But we were I just mentioned the entire thing with the Betelgeuse going supernova. The Huffington Post, which they're not known for their science articles, I admit this, but they originally picked it up and did an article on this. We were talking about this briefly, and unfortunately, in the process of sensationalizing it to make it interesting, they casually commented that it could explode next year in 2112, or it could happen later on. But apparently,
Puka, we're losing
the
you.
sensational aspect of 2112 with the Mayan calendar, a whole bunch of nutters picked it up. Oh, you're losing me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now. Yeah, you're fine now.
Okay. No, I was saying, so because of that one small sensationalist line, a whole bunch of people picked up on that, and all of a sudden they're saying that Betelgeuse is going to be the sign of the end of the world when it explodes with the end of the Mayan calendar in 2112, and it's yeah, unfortunate.
I actually read an article. I actually read that article in the or read I don't know if it was on my Google homepage or some porn site directed me to it or what. I don't know how I found it.
And this seems to be the way that most of the news is written. It's written at that level. I know if people say that newspapers are written at a third grade level, I will give them more credit for that. I think it's actually written at a middle school level. But that's what it seems to be. And science is supposed to be loftier than that. It's supposed to have a bit more consideration for understanding and improving of our knowledge than that.